Okay, welcome back. And in this video, we're going to be going over how to create a user model. Let's compare it to the blog model, for example. In the blog model, we've got a few methods that we're missing actually in the user model, such as save to Mongo or JSON, and we're going to add those in just now. And all of these simply interact with the database by using the collection and using the JSON method. And then they store some information as well. So the user is going to be the same thing. So the first thing we have to think about is what information or what data is the user model going to be holding. And in order to think of that, we can think of what is the user going to do when they get to our website. They're going to want to register or log in. And in order to register or log in, we're going to need an email and a password. And users are also going to have a list of blogs. But the blogs really are not part of the user, but the user owns them. So they don't necessarily have to be inside the user model. So really, what I'm getting to here is the only thing we need is email and password for the user. And we can store those two in the user model, and then when we save to the database or see if the different things the user does, we can use the email and password to verify things. So let me create the JSON and save to Mongo methods because we forgot last video. And now let's begin by the first one, get by email. So get by email is a fairly simple method. What we have to do is say database, import the database, dot find one, and then the users collection, which is users. And then find by email is simply going to be email is self email. That makes sense. And then say data is equal to that. And this will either be a user or none if no user was found with that email. So if data is not none, return, and we'll return CLS asterisk data. However, this CLS, we don't have it because we said we're using the current object. And we don't really want to do that, so we're going to have to change this to a class method and change that to CLS. Instead of self.email, we will pass the email in. And why am I doing this? Why not use self? Simply because when we're getting a user by an email, we won't already have a user. So we won't have a current object at that time. When we're calling this method, what we'll be interested in is in looking at the database and finding the user. We won't yet have the user object. So that's why this has to be a class method. And for the same reason, this other method has also got to be a class method too. And get by ID is actually going to be pretty much the same, except instead of email, we're going to use the underscore ID, which of course reminds us that we should also have the ID here. And I'm going to go into the blog and copy that because that makes more sense. Okay, so now we're assigning an ID to our user as well if they don't have one, or if they do have one, then it'll just get passed through. Okay. The login valid is simply to check whether they are logged in, whether the password that they've given us is correct or not. So the first thing to do is say user equals user.find by email, get by email rather. And then here we'll pass the email that we are getting here. Now this user will either be a valid user object, remember we are creating the user object here, or it will be none, which is the default return type. So this is default in Python. So if we don't write anything, then if data is none, it'll not do that, and instead it will return none. So user will either be a valid user or it will be none. So if user is not none, then we can check the password. If the user is none, then we'll return false because it means that the login is invalid. The user doesn't exist. So if user is not none, we will check the password. So return user password equals password, and the password will be passed as a parameter. Okay, so what this does is, sorry, actually this will be a full stop there. User.password equals password. This creates the user object, and then if the user is not none, it means we found one. So then we can check the password, see if the user.password, the password from the database, is equal to the password that is passed to this login_valid method. However, this login valid method does not need self for anything, so we might as well make it static. And now that makes a bit more sense. We can do now user.loginvalid School of Code, and then the password. We can do that, and then that will return true if that email and password combination is valid, or false if it is not valid. Okay, so that's how we would check that, and then in order to register, it's going to be pretty much the same. So it's once again going to be a static method, and it's going to get an email and password as parameters, and what it's going to do is if the user already exists, then it will fail, and if the user does not already exist, then it will create the user. So the first thing we have to do is user get by email with this email, and if user is none, user doesn't exist, so we can create it, else user exists. So if the user does not exist, we can create the user. So what we'll do is say new user equals user email password, and then new user save to Mongo. And if the user already exists, we will return false. Okay, so if this makes sense, then that's fantastic. We're getting the user by email, and this will either return none if the user does not exist, or it will return something if the user does exist. So if the user is none, it means it does not exist, so we can create it. And if the user is not none, it means the user exists, so we cannot create it, and we return false. We are using the user class here, but that's the current class we're in. So rather, instead of making this a static method, we can actually make it a class method and use CLS there. And instead of user here, use CLS there. And now you wonder, why would you do that? Quite simply because if we change the user class name, then we don't have to change this method. So that makes it a bit easier. But really, that's the only reason. So not particularly optimal. I mean, it's not an optimized operation, but it simply saves us time later on if we do decide to change something. Okay, so this is not a very nice method because it will either return none. This is the default. Return none will happen here because we're not returning anything, so the default will be to return none. We're returning none if the user was created okay, and we're returning false if the user was not created okay. To me, returning none does not immediately sound like a good thing. In fact, it sounds like something was missing. So probably we should return true here. And returning false makes sense because we failed to register, but we are not giving any information as to why we failed. So we should probably tell the application layer that the user already exists, so that then we can show the user a message in the website. But we're not going to worry about that just now, because it adds a little bit of complexity to the issue here. So let's not worry about that, and just return false, which means we failed. And we can show the user a message saying we could not register you at this time, or something along those lines. All right. So the next few things to do would be to create these other methods. But this video is getting a bit long, so we're going to leave that for the next video. So I'll see you there.